So Alexis has this beautiful repoussé pendant. You may recognize it from the little video that I showed you guys of doing the repoussé, using that little dot wax inner support to put that beautiful thing in there. So here it is in its almost finished form. And she's using as her bail a beautiful little piece of tubing, which you saw us do many months ago. We did a bunch of tubing together. And that's going to make a really nice looking bail and very simple and clean, which really suits kind of this design. So the tricky thing about putting these two together is that they're only really going to touch dead center once we put these two together, because the top of this is curved. Now, some people might say, oh, you can file a flat. To file enough of a flat to get a lot of contact point would start to mess up our shape, and it's just not something that we want to do. So Alexis and I actually, before we started filming this, we're talking about the 35 ways that we can set this up. And I'm going to explain to you why I do it the way I do it. There's a lot of different ways that you could go about it. For me, the guiding light is always, I don't want any cleanup. I won't have any cleanup unless I absolutely have to. So that's why we're going to do it the way that I'm going to show you. Because, for example, sometimes with something like this, you can half melt a little piece of solder right on top, you know, where your bail is going to go. And then you can pickle it and you set it up with your bail, and that works fine. However, when you're doing that half melting thing with your piece of solder here, it is also very common for it to maybe go somewhere where you don't want it to go, to spread a little too much, you know, like rather than, if you don't pull away the second that the solder softens, it can kind of run along that curve, and then you're cleaning up and then, you know, the dreaded cleanup. So that's why what I'm going to actually do is I am going to take a little square, and I'm going to heat this up a little bit with a little paste flux and stick it on there. And I'm going to lay the two together, and we're going to heat it up and we're going to flow it. Now, a lot of times I will use a little ball, but because of the way that the small contact point between the bail and here, it's very difficult to get a little ball in there only touching where I want the solder to go, which again, I really don't want any solder to end up getting on that curved bail, or the, you know, I don't want it anywhere but where I want it. So more ways than one to do this for sure, but this is how we're going to do it because I think this is going to give us the cleanest result. So I'm going to cut my little piece of medium solder, which is the blue. Go. If you need one piece of solder, never cut one. That just guarantees that you will lose it, and then you'll go crazy. I'm looking around for the paste flux, which has mysteriously disappeared. Ah, yes. So, you ready? We have a little Sharpie mark where we want the bail to go. So I don't want to put a scratch on here, so that's why we're using that. It'll burn off, of course, once we heat it up. So no doubt once we set it up, if that burns away, we'll have to kind of get up and look at it from all the angles and, you know, bajillion check that everything is exactly where we want it. But I think I'm going to put a little dot of paste flux right where I want my solder to be. Too big of a dot. Okay. I'm going to heat it a tiny bit, and then I'm going to wet one of the little pieces of solder, and usually if this is a little warm, it'll kind of stick right where you want it to go. So now that I have the torch lit, I'm just going to warm that up a little bit. And I'm going to take my little piece of solder. Just dip it a tiny bit in the wet flux, because usually if this is warm and this is a tiny bit wet, you can kind of stick them together. Okay, so it slid a little bit, so I'll dry it and poke it. But you notice also, by the way, I drink a lot of coffee, and for those of you who are trying to place things, always brace your hand against the table first before you try to set anything down. You need all the help you can get to really like get something where you want it to be. sometimes it'll pop off like that. So it's good we're doing a realistic video. Fun to watch it hop, right? Could like lay bets on it. Be like a drinking game. How many times? You have to drink a shot for every time my solder hops off. So we're gonna do it right on the solderite board here. And all I did, because I don't want to put a third arm on this little bail. I don't want it to get squished. So I just put a little T-pin down in the block, just enough that way I can kind of push it up against there, and it should help me to keep everything together. Sometimes all you need is just a little something to push against. And yes, setting it up to solder is the slow and tedious part. The actual soldering is the usually relatively fun and fast part. So just remember when you're doing your setup, take a deep breath and shake it out and relax. And however many times it takes to get it in the right spot, it'll be worth it. Although swearing is encouraged. Better out than in is my overriding philosophy. So I just push it up against there, and I can just feel that there's no give. And what we're gonna do is Alexis and I are gonna pause for a second, and we're both gonna look at it from the top and the side and everywhere. And once we're yes, everything is just the way we want it, then we're gonna solder. Yes.
Okay.
So Alexis and I are in agreement. We're happy with where it is. We moved it only, I would say, 50 or 60 times. And we're okay, I think it looks good now. So when you're soldering something small to something much larger, you have to keep your heat on the bigger part. Otherwise, the little thing will get hotter. And what does solder do? Solder loves to run to the hottest spot. So if you're heating that little bail and then your solder just runs onto the bail, you're gonna be pissed because you'll be that's not where I want it. So I'm gonna point my flame. I'm gonna move this to a 0 tip. And I'm gonna be pointing my flame right in here. The bail's gonna get hot just by being in the neighborhood, and I can always give it a flick or two, if I feel that it needs it. But this is much larger, so this is really primarily where my heat needs to be. And I like to solder with my left hand and hold my tweezers in my right hand. That's not really a beginner technique, but it's something that you should start practicing a little and trying to get more and more comfortable, because ultimately that's really what's going to speed you up. After you get a little more comfortable just holding the flame and that's it, switch to your non-dominant hand and just practice a little bit. And the more you do it, obviously the better you get. And that really gives you a lot more flexibility in what you're doing, because I'm going to be heating and possibly poking if necessary. So I've got my tweezers ready. Gently dry. I mean, it's probably dry, but just as a precautionary measure. So I'm going to get up and I'm going to let Alexis get in there and really do a close-up, because even though this was a pain in the ass to set up, it's beautifully filled in there, and we are not going to have to clean up anywhere. Hopefully you can see the solder seam in there.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's amazing.
Excellent. So that's why sometimes it's worth doing the more pain in the ass setup. And that's why actually we sat here and discussed this for a few minutes, because normally I'm like, let's solder, woo! But I was like, no, maybe this, maybe that, to try to get to the method that's going to give me like the cleanest result, which as you all know already, I am totally obsessed with. So in case you couldn't see, there it is. It's all soldered on and pretty. So now we're going to pickle it.